Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, this is James, and welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. And today we are discussing the experiences of people who have attempted to stop taking psychiatric drugs. These experiences are captured in a survey undertaken by the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. And joining me to talk about this work are Cathal Cadogan and Agnes Higgins, both from Trinity College. Cathal is an associate professor in practice of pharmacy in Trinity College. His research focuses on developing supports to help people make informed decisions about starting and stopping psychiatric medication. He was recently involved in a priority-setting partnership to identify priorities for future research on reducing and discontinuing psychiatric medicines. Agnes is a nurse, researcher and academic who has recently retired as a professor in mental health at the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Trinity College. She is a former chairperson of the Board of Mental Health Reform, Ireland's leading service user organisation, campaigning for improvements in mental health services. She's also currently a board member of Kiri Farm, an innovative initiative combining the benefits of nature, meaningful participation, community and therapy to support mental health recovery. Their work is part of a wider examination of priorities for future research on reducing and stopping psychiatric medication, and we'll talk about this as well as the findings of their survey. We'll also talk about the role that pharmacists could potentially play when people are considering stopping their psychiatric drugs. Cathal, Agnes, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Mad in America podcast. We're here to talk about a recent paper that you both collaborated on entitled, "I Wish It Were More Often Told to People Before They Are Prescribed These Medications How Hard It Is to Get Off Them, a Qualitative Descriptive Analysis of Free Text Responses to a Survey on Reducing and Stopping Psychiatric Medication." And this was published, I believe, in the journal Health Expectations in August 2025. Before we get to talk about that, I just wanted to thank you both because in my experience as someone that has been on and had a difficult time getting off psychiatric drugs, I think it's quite unusual for those with knowledge of that experience to be involved in a survey like this. So I was really pleased to see this work being done and obviously the effort that went into it. So before we get to talk about the paper, it would be really nice if I could ask you both to perhaps introduce yourselves and maybe share a little bit about your interest in reducing and stopping psychiatric drugs. So, Agnes, could we start with you?
Okay, thanks, James. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Agnes Higgins, and my clinical background is nursing. I have over 40 years, I suppose, experience in clinical practice, research and education, and was professor in mental health in the School of Nursing and Midwifery in Trinity in Dublin. My interest in the subject area and in people coming off medication, I suppose some of it arises out of my own clinical experience of seeing people being prescribed medication. And then from a research perspective, I suppose it dates back to around 2015-16, when myself and a colleague were looking at the literature in this area. And then we did a small qualitative piece of work within the Irish context. And I suppose what struck me at that time in terms of the body of literature was that while there was a lot done on why people stopped taking medication, it was often done with a compliance lens, that people were interested in understanding why people stopped, but the motivation was understanding for keeping people on medication. From that led us to kind of think about where the voice of lived experience was in that work. And so Mike Watts and myself did a piece of work with some colleagues that was published in kind of nursing journals back in 2021. We published.
Great. Thank you, Agnes. And Cathal?
So again, thank you, James, for having us. So my name is Cathal Cadogan. I'm an associate professor here in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at Trinity College, Dublin. I'm a pharmacist by background. I suppose my research is really focused on, the safe and appropriate use of medicines. And when it comes to psychiatric medicines, I think I've developed an interest in terms of how people navigate making informed decisions around starting and stopping medications. When I joined Trinity, I was delighted to kind of cross paths with Agnes, and this kind of opened up the pathway to this project and this study that we're going to talk about today.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful. And so then moving on to the paper, I mean, Agnes, you've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wondered what was the kind of drive or the motivation to try and find out more about the experience of people trying to stop or reduce their psychiatric drugs? And maybe, how did you go about finding out? I mean, for example, it was really nice to see in this particular paper that the three groups of key people were involved, people with lived experience of this, prescribers themselves, but also family members. And family members quite often are forgotten about, I think, when this kind of work is done. So, how did the idea for this work come about? And then how did you go about capturing the responses?
The paper that you're referencing is part of a larger body of work. So I have to really give Cathal the credit on the larger body of work, because it was part of a priority setting exercise around identifying research priorities for people coming off medication. And we were following a particular methodology called the James Lind Alliance methodology. And that methodology is very much focused on getting the voices of key stakeholders. So in terms of the clinical people, the family, and the people with lived experience.
I suppose by other background and context as well, that this formed part of a PhD by Dr. Miriam Boland, who we were supervising, and the initial idea for the PhD was quite different, but I suppose we were kind of thinking about what would make more sense in terms of this space and helping to kind of progress research. So we decided to take a bit of a step back, and this methodology, the James Alliance Priority Setting Partnership, is really about identifying the top 10 priorities or unanswered questions for research in a particular area. So we focus obviously on reducing and stopping psychiatric medicines. And that is a very structured process. We were very keen to be an official JLA or James Lind Alliance PSP or Priority Setting Partnership. So to really incorporate, the James Lind Alliance and to follow their methodology very explicitly throughout. From the outset, there was a panel of stakeholders who represented all of the key stakeholder groups. They very much led all of the decision making within the project. So it was quite a step change for us as researchers, because essentially we were handing over the control and the decision making to them. We would have facilitated the data collection and analysis, but ultimately, kind of final say was up to the steering group.
And Cathal, what kind of people were on the steering group?
So we had representatives of each of the three stakeholder groups that you mentioned earlier. So, people with lived experience, family members and carers, and clinicians. And within that, then we were also keen to try and have, a mix of people with differing experiences. So both positive and negative when it came to the use of medication, or psychiatric medication. And to an extent, we tried to have, diversity in terms of, backgrounds and so on. Which was a little bit more challenging to achieve, but we did our best, guided by the steering group as well.
And I think one of the exciting things, I suppose, about it is, in terms of the bigger project of identifying research priorities, is that a lot of the times when in the mental health spaces, James, that the people who decide on the research priorities in that space are usually the researchers or the clinicians. And the voice of lived experience and families don't really get into that. And if we do engage people with lived experience, our families, it's usually when the research has already been decided and the aims and objectives have decided. And then we bring people in at that stage, but we don't really bring people in at the priority setting. That was an exciting piece of this whole research piece, that we were starting to get people involved in deciding what the priorities were.
It was really nice, actually, to see quite clearly in the paper that people's experience had been put front and center, as you say, Agnes, right from the start, right from the design of it and the priorities and all the rest of it. On that point, if I'm right, the kind of survey, rather than being a tick box exercise where you had already prepared things for people to answer, you kind of had a free text response, so people could write in ways that meant something to them about their experience. And, I really like the idea of that, but I guess that must have been quite hard to kind of, process from a data point of view, where you got some people who would have written a lot and some people not very much and might not be touching on the areas you want. So was it challenging to do it that way, or was that really the only way the survey could have been done?
in the larger project, we asked people to identify areas for research. So that was one of the pieces. But this free text response was about giving people a chance to write other comments. We didn't prescribe in terms of words. We didn't ask particular questions in that space. So people could tell us. Now, of course, like any research methods, you kind of say you don't get the depth that you get if you interview people. But in this context, it was important because we were getting a breadth of responses from lived experience families and from practitioners, but also we were getting them. It wasn't just done in Ireland, like there was a number of countries. So people were answering this online from a number of countries. And that I think was an important piece because it was also about seeing, is this something that's unique to Ireland or England, or are we hearing things that are right across in various jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, there was such a vast amount of data gathered, even from that. So there was 2 rounds of the survey, but the first round survey was the free text response survey. So you're right, there wasn't a set list of pre-populated kind of research priorities that we wanted people to tick. So they could write really whatever they wanted. And I think when Miriam did her analysis, I think there was over 3,500 unique questions within the data. And they had to be kind of verified in terms of what scope, were they in scope of the project? Were they focused on tapering of psychiatric medicines? And then to distill that down into themes and categories of questions. I suppose what we really wanted to make sure was that we captured those views and experiences that might have fallen between the cracks if we had just focused purely on, the unanswered questions, or did these meet the criteria of research priorities that we should be kind of including in our top 10 list. So it was really to try and add that depth and insight. That was the value, the added value of this.
Yeah.
If we could talk about the results a little bit, then it's really nice in the paper actually to see where you've pulled out quotes from different responders, because it really makes the experience kind of live, maybe in a way that a statistical chart wouldn't. It gives it so much more kind of human richness. So, I mean, it's fair to say that some of the responders, whether they're prescribers or users or family members, were positive about their psychiatric drug treatment experience, but more of the responses were negative. So I just wondered if that surprised you.
To be honest, not really, but I think it was very important for us that there was that element of the positive experiences in terms of taking psychiatric medication or finding supports in terms of discontinuing, or, that period afterwards where someone is free of the medication. So again, I think it was interesting, and I think useful to highlight that there is potentially light for patients, because again, I know we hear a lot about the negative aspects, from the adverse effects to the withdrawal symptoms, and even kind of beyond the taper and so on. But yeah, I think for us it was important to have that element of balance, that it wasn't just we weren't trying to just portray a negative story or anything like that, and very much guided by what people had actually put into the survey responses. So we weren't approaching it with any kind of pre-defined kind of lens or anything like that. We were just very open to what people had said.
And I think that people were, the positive about the help that medications give for some people in terms of sleep, their thought process. But I think the issues for a lot of people was that the lack of information and education, the lack of, I suppose, information around the challenges in coming off medication, and the lack of, I suppose, supports. I think that was kind of the big issue for people. And that wasn't just from people with lived experience, but the clinicians themselves were all talking about, I suppose, the lack of supports in this space, including the lack of research evidence in this space. Sometimes people, weren't clear around guidelines and what the evidence base is there.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm right, from the paper, there were 6 main themes identified. Is that right? So there were people's experiences of using the medication. There were challenges to reducing and stopping, as you said, Agnes. Yeah, there were strategies used to reduce or stop. Then outcomes, so how people fared after they'd come off. And then what was really important was the 5th one was emotional context. And that for me is, as someone that's been through this process, I found that quite compelling, and again, we must say there were positive and negative experiences reported, but when negative experiences were reported, there was a lot of emotion coming through. One person I think said it was a hellish experience. And also, interestingly, on the prescriber side, there were some doctors that were clearly challenging this concept of, the chemical imbalance and, educating their patients on this is not the way that antidepressants work. But then another one said that I'm really tired of the demonization of antidepressants. So, what I really liked about the survey was how the kind of emotion of this is captured, because to me, from my experience, coming off antidepressants was a physical thing, but it was a very emotional and psychological, challenging thing in many areas. And so did you design the survey and this work really to kind of capture that raw emotion, or did it just kind of fall out of the process? Because, that's the part that kind of intrigued me most about the work.
So we didn't kind of design it. And so I suppose in some ways, the fact that it emerged without us asking a question or a direct question in that space kind of tells us something about, as you said, from your own lived experience, the level of emotion that I suppose this area provokes in people, and I suppose it also, the piece of that kind of sometimes polarized discussion that happens. And how do we move beyond that polarizing discussion that, when we end up with two camps, they're coming off and they're staying on. Sometimes if we get so polarized, we close it down rather than open it up for a conversation. So I think that is one of the nice things about it, is that you're seeing the multiple voices in this space.
It was quite evident in the responses. Essentially, all of that commentary has been distilled down into a top 10 list of priorities, which are really, really important. But again, it's that added context and I suppose human side to what goes on behind, these uncertainties and how people, the emotional consequences that people have to suffer sometimes as a result of lack of information, lack of support, lack of evidence, and so on.
Yeah. And I think it's important for clinical people to get a sense of the distress and anger and frustration that people with lived experience are feeling when they engage with our clinical services. And, and clinical services maybe that haven't moved on to thinking about the people's rights of coming off medication. When we started doing some work back in 10 years ago, there was a much more focus on kind of compliance. And that was even evident in that. So when we went for our ethics, for that small qualitative piece of work, James, that the ethics committee were concerned around, whether we would be encouraging people to come off medication. Whereas I think in that intervening years, I think it's great to see that we have now moved where we are having a discussion about people's human rights and rights to come off medication, and, really having a proper conversation around people's rights to information before they go on medication. Now, in terms of getting that right across the board in clinical practice and services, we maybe have a good bit still to go. But at least the conversation is starting to open up. And even 10 years ago, we were not in the space. People were not talking about tapering and coming off medication. So it's great to see that shift.
Of the 6 themes that you identified, one of the things that leapt out for me was there were quite a lot of comments around how difficult the process of tapering itself is. So when people came to the actual process, so many of the comments were, I couldn't get a liquid form, tapering strips are available, but I couldn't find any information about them. My prescriber didn't know about ways to taper off, or even that some people felt that their prescriber mandated a withdrawal schedule for them that they felt caused problems for them. So there was even a comment from a pharmacist who said the only thing I remember being taught in school about these kind of drugs was that you can't stop benzodiazepines very quickly because of the risk of seizures coming off. So, it kind of begs the question, does this work suggest there's a bigger role for pharmacists particularly, but maybe pharmacists are the ones that would have the knowledge and experience to actually help people taper?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think in Belgium, there is a scheme being piloted at the moment to help people with certain classes of psychotropic medications in terms of tapering down and kind of getting the right doses. Within the school here, we do have another PhD going on at the moment that is actually looking at the accuracy of some of the practical approaches that people share online in terms of how to achieve, the small enough doses, if they are kind of following the hyperbolic taper and getting really down to the the very low doses that, you know, aren't practically achievable with commercially available tablets, and do require even manipulations of commercial liquid formulations as well. So that work is ongoing, and I do hope that we'll have findings to share, you know, within the next year or so. But yeah, I could definitely see a role for pharmacists then in terms of guiding both patients and clinicians in terms of what is achievable with what's available in terms of existing formulations, but then also in terms of how to achieve it if preparation needs to be compounded then as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the paper does a really good job of showing that there really isn't a cookie cutter approach to this. There really isn't one set of rules that you can easily apply to every patient. That is difficult, isn't it? Particularly for GPs with very, very little time to actually spend with a person to design a particular schedule. But, you know, I think, Cathal, as you say, that, you know, we've seen with tapering strips maybe in the Netherlands that there are ways that people can operate more in a shared decision-making way, I think, when they are given the time and their experiences are trusted and listened to.
Yeah, I was going to say, and there's kind of a body of work, I suppose, in terms of the whole education of practitioners. It's not just about a physical process of tapering, because, as you say, you know, and as the findings say, that there's also an emotional piece. So there's also that, you know, engagement with practitioners from an emotional perspective around and understanding people's desire to come off and why they want to come off, and what are the challenges that people may experience in coming off, not just from a physical point of view, but also in terms of that the challenges of where maybe family members, people like that, are thinking that is not a good solution. So how do we engage in that space as well? And how do we support people in that space?
It's really interesting you say that, Agnes, and actually I'm really interested in the way that people view benzodiazepines differently to antidepressants now. You know, benzos, it's kind of accepted, they're very short term, that, you know, you should avoid abrupt discontinuation because of problems, but that's because they seem to be connected to a condition of anxiety, which is seen as episodic. You know, it arises and gives you a problem, then it goes away again. And so, you know, benzos can operate in that short window, whereas antidepressants, pharma has tried to sell them as perhaps a lifelong treatment for a lifelong condition that you are unlikely to remit from. So there seems to be much more resistance then to actually saying, well, maybe a short-term course of antidepressants is fine. Maybe we should taper people on a few months, taper them off again. But there's natural resistance there, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's the same with medications like antipsychotics. You know, the long-term effects. And I mean, even for us, it was an interesting kind of discussion at the very beginning. We were putting our steering group together, and we were deciding the scope, whether we were including anxiolytics, antidepressants, or antipsychotics. So there is a whole fear around that space, around people that are being prescribed antipsychotics and have had a psychotic experience.
Surveys of this kind that have done in the past. So, for example, there was one that was done by John Reed and James Davies. It's referenced in your paper. When that survey came out, psychiatrists who responded to it said, well, this is sampling bias, or, you know, the only people that share their experiences are people that have had negative experiences, because the people that are doing well on it are getting on with their lives and they don't fill in surveys. You know, so is that criticism fair? You know, and again, I stress, you know, your paper showed the balance with positive and negative. But I just wondered if psychiatry is going to say, well, these are only the people that fill in surveys that complain. Is there any truth to that?
For me, sometimes when I hear that, I kind of, as a clinician, I kind of think, okay, statistical numbers versus clinical significance. So let's stop talking about the bias, talking about, you know, if it's 800 people who have had a negative experience and who are looking for extra supports, and that it's 800 people and it's 800 human beings. So I'm not interested in hearing about the bias. I'm interested in hearing about, you know, what do we need to do to support that 800? Because if it's only one person, it's clinically important. You know, that's my clinical head and my human piece of me responding, rather than the statistical researcher.
Well, I like that answer very much, Agnes. And, you know, that's what came through for me in the paper. You know, it presents a very much human experience of what can be for some an extremely challenging process, you know, and one that prescribers might need to reassess their thoughts about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the bigger picture thinking with the other study. The largest study was that it would provide a blueprint or a roadmap for researchers to, I suppose, maybe support proposals or funding applications, to kind of progress research in this space. That there had been a body of work done with the input of all the relevant stakeholders to kind of say that these are legitimate, unanswered questions that people need answers to. People with lived experience, but also healthcare professionals in terms of how to make decisions in clinical practice. And again, the great thing about having done a formal James Lind Alliance priority setting partnership is that the NIH in the UK does recognise them, and there is a call that allows researchers to submit research proposals or funding applications to progress research that addresses questions within a James Lind Alliance priority setting partnership.
That's really positive to hear. Thank you, Cathal. And so I was wondering, kind of based on your own experiences and those presented in the survey, if you had any thoughts on what prescribers should be doing to improve the experience for people wanting to safely stop their antidepressants. So, for example, there is quite a lot in the paper about informed consent. There's quite a lot on, there are a few people mentioned shared decision-making type approaches. So I just wondered if, as kind of clinicians, maybe, are the things that stand out for you in terms of how we might improve this process for people?
I suppose ultimately listening to people and kind of accepting their experiences is probably a key thing. And I mean, one of the challenges with a survey like this is, as you said, there are self-selected samples. So we are hearing from people maybe who've had more extreme experiences, and that there are patients obviously who do have good experiences, and we saw that in the papers. But it's a way of, I suppose, trying to figure out how, firstly, to identify when people have problems around kind of maybe discontinuation, and how best to support them and make sure that they are supported over that period if they need it.
I think it is about a conversation and a dialogue, as opposed to what I sometimes call a compliance monologue. Often when people want to come off medication, the default position historically has been a conversation about why you need to stay on. So I think it's maybe starting from that, from a dialogue perspective, where it's trying to understand the perspective of the person in terms of why they would want to come off.
The next thing that I'm thinking about really is, you've both talked about this being part of a wider piece of work, which is really reassuring to know. What are your thoughts on what we should be doing to build on the work that you've done in this survey and in the wider piece of work? And really, is there a take-home message for people considering taking antidepressants, or for prescribers when initiating them?
I think going back to the top 10 list that we have kind of identified through the broader project, and I suppose trying to drum up support from funding agencies to invest in this area. I think, as Agnes alluded to earlier, sometimes that topic of discontinuation of medications can be kind of contentious, and it doesn't maybe always get the support that it needs from funding to kind of progress the research and ultimately to help people make those informed decisions about, what is the right approach, when is it right, and, who should be considered. And also particularly how to identify people who are at higher risk of, negative experiences from the process as well.
And I think that there's a body of work in the whole education space of, like, we talk about shared decision making. So I think there is a body of work with practitioners around their education, so that they can feel confident and comfortable in having that conversation around coming off medication and tapering, and having a conversation around what with our current evidence base says versus where the gaps in the evidence is. So I think that there's a big kind of piece there in that educational space. And I think that's an important piece, so that we get people to move from the compliance monologue, that they have a comfort in opening up, and that they see that the importance of that conversation from a safety perspective. Because if people are coming off medication without the information, or if they're coming off it alone and not engaging with practitioners, there is a risk that they come off quickly and they experience all of the negative side of things. So I'd like clinicians to see this conversation as being part of their safety piece of practice, that having this conversation is about holding people in a safe space rather than being afraid to have this conversation.
That's so important. And certainly, I think there needs to be balance there, doesn't there? In terms of the prescriber might think that they are an expert on this particular drug or this particular treatment, but the person in front of them is an expert in their own experience, and they need to be allowed the autonomy to work in partnership with the prescriber rather than be prescribed to without the opportunity to talk about fears and barriers and, the future and all those kind of things.
And I think that's the piece, because we might think we're the expert in it, but I mean, in terms of the evidence, there's so many gaps in the evidence here that it's too hard to say that as a clinician that we're expert on anything in this space in terms of coming off, because we're only starting, having those conversations. We're only starting to develop the evidence base. The importance of I suppose, humility as a clinician, and humility in listening to the person's that's on the other end who is taking this medication and their experience, because we can learn so much from listening to that individual, but equally listening collectively on people's experiences.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate you spending time with me today to talk about this. I think it's no surprise that I think this is incredibly important work, some of the most important work there is, to actually get a sense and a feel for where the gaps are between what prescribers might be think is happening and what people are actually experiencing when they even start these things, stop them. You really are, as I said, completing a large piece of a very complex jigsaw here, which I think is really important. And, I'd like to thank you both, and also your other authors, Miriam and Suk-Young. And I really look forward to other work that your school is doing on this. And thank you so much both for joining me.
Well, look, thank you again, James.
Thanks, James.
So thank you so much for joining us today. Please visit the Mad in America website for more information, or you can find us on Substack if you make use of it. Just search for Mad in America.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.